This is Rambod Behboodi, Senior Counsel at Borden, Ladner, Gervais in Ottawa. I'm here with Stephen de Boer, former Canadian Ambassador to the World Trade Organization. And this is the Tariff Home Companion, a new podcast to shed light, not heat, on trade and tariff issues affecting Canada and Canadians. We're back to talk trade. In the last two episodes, we've discussed diversification. Where and how do we search for markets, expanding existing trade relationships or establishing new ones? What should we be selling? What do we need to do to reduce, and not eliminate dependence on the rich markets south of the 49th parallel? We will continue to talk diversification, and we are fortunate to have an expert from one of Canada's closest trade and strategic allies for the past century. Stephen and I will provide deep background into a controversial sector and then expand out to discuss a visionary and potentially revolutionary trade agreement. First, the sector. Stephen and I met almost exactly 30 years ago in the context of the Canada-US dispute under the NAFTA on supply management. That's the controversial sector. Having just joined the Department of Foreign Affairs, I was the most junior lawyer on the file, which also meant I had to know every nook and cranny, every footnote, every piece of evidence, every point of strength, and every weakness of a very complex and politically sensitive file. And yes, I was also the note taker at the end of the table in both internal and external meetings. Stephen was on the Ontario delegation. That's how we met, in a federal provincial technical briefing in the summer of 1995. And here we are, 30 years later, still talking trade, still talking supply management. Anyway, the NAFTA dispute was very simple. The NAFTA had entered into force in 1994 and prohibited the imposition of new tariffs. It's right there in black and white in Article 302 of the NAFTA. As of January 1st, 1995, however, Canada had started imposing tariffs of up to 350% on butter, milk, cheese, eggs, and chicken, and sundry other products. Clearly illegal, the US argued. And 30 years later, the US president was still talking about 400% tariffs and TRQs and such. As I said, very simple. And I can already hear the gallery. Aha! That's why the fentanyl and reciprocity and national security tariffs are justified. Canada broke the NAFTA 30 years ago. It's all about supply management. If only we got rid of it, the sunny uplands will return. There will be rivers of milk and butter across the 49th parallel, and we will have peace in our time. I should have said that with an English accent, I guess. Well, not so fast. The US lost that case, bigly, so to speak. Trade, it seems, is complicated. And no, there are no 400% tariffs on butter. If you got rid of supply management, the price of butter will not suddenly drop to $2 a pound. Let's start with the basics. Trade in agricultural products has always been a matter of special concern. Part of it is the reality and the mythology surrounding the family farm and its centrality to discourse across economic and political structures and partisan interests. Part of it has to do with legitimate concerns about food security. To give an example, the state of Wisconsin alone produces 28% more milk than all of Canada put together. Imports could shut down Canadian production. And then you are at the mercy of the White House for access to a basic staple. And then there's food safety. Again, a toxic brew of reality and myth. This is why agricultural trade has always been treated differently from other goods. Now, this is for the gallery. The US was no exception. And in some ways, it was worse. In 1955, that is 8 years after the establishment of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT, the US threatened to withdraw from the treaty it had set up unless it was given special treatment in respect of agricultural products. This is the infamous Section 22 waiver that allowed the US to restrict the importation of dairy products, sugar, cotton, tobacco, and peanuts. That special treatment lasted until 1995, when the WTO agreement entered into force. Since then, the US protects its agricultural producers through a sophisticated framework of onerous labeling and inspections and tariffs that make importation nearly impossible. What about other countries like Canada? Well, unlike the US, the rest of us could not simply threaten to leave the GATT unless we got special treatment. We could not simply go ahead and impose import restrictions on agricultural products just because. There were rules, and we largely respected those rules. Canada, like all other parties to the GATT, had to abide by the requirement that import restrictions could be put in place only if there were limits to domestic production. And that's where supply management comes in. Okay, so what is supply management? It's a complex national marketing framework that tries to match domestic production and pricing of certain agricultural products to projected national demand. It covers milk and derivative products, eggs, chicken, and turkey. It has 4 core objectives. First, to ensure that Canadians have access to continuous and adequate supply. This is the food security aspect of the framework. Second, to maintain agricultural production in all regions of the country. Third, to contribute to the development of rural Canada. And fourth, to ensure the survival of the traditional family farm structure by providing a framework for long-term financial security. So, how did we end up with one? Well, the first marketing board, established by BC in 1927, tried to equalize the bargaining relationship between producers and processors. It was found unconstitutional. The Depression, however, accelerated the need for a framework to act essentially as a rural counterpart to largely urban social programs such as unemployment insurance to respond to economic dislocation. All provinces established their own marketing boards between 1936 and 1956. They worked for a while. But by the 1960s, advances in production and shipping methods meant that all over the place, there was more agricultural production than markets could sustain. This led to surpluses. Prices tumbled. Agricultural incomes were low and unstable. This was, incidentally, a global phenomenon. Those of us of a certain vintage recall the infamous lakes of milk and mountains of butter that plagued Europe throughout the 1980s. At any rate, purely provincial solutions were no longer enough. And so it was that in 1970, the federal government proposed establishing a national framework to stabilize production and prices. And the provinces agreed, all of them. Consistently with the GATT, the system provided for domestic production limits and restrictions on imports in the form of quotas, limits on how much can be imported into Canada. So here's the first of our mileposts. When Canada and the United States negotiated the Free Trade Agreement and then the NAFTA, both countries had in place import restrictions in the form of quotas on agricultural products. The US under its special treatment, and Canada under the prevailing rules. Under those trade agreements, each country kept its existing measures, and they agreed, as set out in special chapters, to deal with agriculture in the context of the GATT. Okay, so what was going on in the GATT at the time? In 1986, GATT parties launched a new multilateral negotiating round. The Uruguay round would eventually lead to the WTO in 1995. That's right. Even as we were negotiating the Free Trade Agreement and the NAFTA with the United States, we were also engaged in multilateral negotiations with the US in Geneva. That's our second milepost. We dealt with tariffs here, we dealt with agriculture over there. That was the deal. Okay, so what about the GATT and agriculture? By 1986, it was clear that the GATT framework for agriculture was not working. And there were many issues, but one of the biggest was, of course, the fact that the US had a special deal. As if that weren't bad enough, the US, benefiting from its special deal, kept challenging other countries' agricultural policies and practices. Something had to be done. The most momentous thing that was done was tariffication. Let me explain. If I told you that Canada had the right to export only 830 tons of cheddar cheese to the United States, does that tell you anything at all about the impact of that quota on prices in the US market? What if I said that Canada could export more, but it would be subject to 25% tariffs for the excess amount? So that was the deal under the GATT. Just as NAFTA negotiations were coming to an end, Canada, the US, and other negotiating parties agreed to convert their quotas, which meant nothing to consumers, to tariffs, which were transparent. Hence, tariffication. Members could review the tariffied measures proposed by each other, and then in 1994, they all signed up on one another's new tariffs. There would be, in general, two levels of tariffs: a low level that would apply to a certain quantity of imports, and a higher level that would apply to any amount above that. That's why Canada and the United States ended up with additional tariffs and tariff rate quotas, or TRQs, on certain agricultural products as of January 1st, 1995. These tariffs, the same tariffs that the US was applying, were the measures that the US challenged under the NAFTA. Well, the panel was not impressed. It found that in the NAFTA itself, the parties agreed to leave agriculture to the GATT. Under the GATT, future WTO members were required as part of a complete deal to convert quotas into tariffs. And the US had signed off on Canada's tariffs, just as Canada had signed off on the US measures. That was the deal under the NAFTA. And when the NAFTA was renegotiated and replaced by the CUSMA, Canada and the United States retained their tariffied measures. That's the third milepost. The deal that President Trump signed included supply management. They got better access, but that was that. In the same vein, supply management did not stop Canada from entering into free trade agreements with the EU or countries of the Asia-Pacific region. And it should be underlined that Canada's defense of its dairy sector in trade negotiations is no different from the US or the EU defense of their beef sector. We all have sensitivities. That's why we negotiate. That's the whole point of negotiations. So far, we've covered the origins and the broad outlines of supply management, the special treatment of the United States in multilateral trade agreements, the bilateral and trilateral negotiations that left agriculture in Geneva, the multilateral negotiations that led to tariffication and TRQs, a US loss in its NAFTA case, the US and Canada retaining supply management in the CUSMA, and Canada's conclusion of a strong network of trade agreements despite supply management. This does not mean that supply management is without problems. Under the WTO, the EU and New Zealand challenged aspects of its administration and won. I dealt with those cases both as a junior lawyer and later when I headed the Market Access Unit at the Trade Law Bureau of the Department of Foreign Affairs. When tariffs are high, there are attempts to circumvent it. This leads to a constant game of cat and mouse between importers and customs enforcement. Even when importers find perfectly legal ways of importing goods outside of the tariff framework, Canada has the option of renegotiating access under the WTO agreement, an option that it has exercised. More recently, the administration of the TRQs has led to disputes under both the CUSMA and the Asia-Pacific Agreement I just referred to, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP.
Thanks, Rambod. I will now turn our attention to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP. And yes, Canadian dairy is an issue here too. The Indo-Pacific has become the world's leading region of economic growth. Of course, with that comes large opportunities for trade and expansion. Where there's trade, where there's an opportunity for expansion, normal trading partners try to find ways to make it happen. And so it was that a whole bunch of Pacific Rim countries, led by the United States, negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But it was not to be. As his first trade act in the first administration, President Trump withdrew the United States from the TPP. And as we have observed before, trade policy, like nature, abhors a vacuum. And so it was that the remaining signatories to the TPP reworked the agreement, but without the United States. The new trade agreement between Canada and the 10 other countries in the Indo-Pacific covers really all sectors and aspects of trade. The CPTPP connects Canada to a trading bloc of 580 million consumers and 15.6% of global GDP, offering preferential access to key markets in Asia and Latin America. Yes, half of Latin America faces the Pacific. It has eliminated tariffs on 98% of exports while providing clear rules of origin and streamlined custom procedures. It also reduces unnecessary regulatory requirements, ensures equal treatment for Canadian firms in government procurement, and removes barriers for temporary entry of business personnel. The agreement offers stability and protection for investments, sets regional standards for intellectual property, and includes commitments to uphold labor and environmental standards. For Canadian businesses, CPTPP improves competitiveness, provides access to new clients in key markets, and enhances transparency and predictability. The agreement showed immediate promise. Within 1 year after the CPTPP coming into force, merchandise exports to the new markets increased 7.1%, and merchandise imports increased 5.5%. Notably, Canada saw a significant increase in the 5 years post-ratification in its merchandise trade, with the 7 Asia-Pacific economies seeing a 38% jump. The CPTPP region, in the last 10 years, has seen its share of global GDP rise 9.9% and GDP per capita rise 13%. Now, these numbers are great, and all but cooperation among parties and full implementation in exactly the same way other parties expect is not always a given. So like all strong trade agreements, the CPP accounts for this possibility with its dispute settlement chapter, Chapter 28. The genesis of a trade dispute is the assessment by a party that a measure of another party is inconsistent with the obligation of the agreement. Now, CPTPP dispute settlement, or any trade dispute, is not an episode of Suits. No one bellows, "See you in court," in the halls of the WTO or the chanceries of the CPTPP parties. Where there is a concern about a trade violation, diplomats are engaged to negotiate and resolve it. If that doesn't work, more diplomacy follows, but in a formal context. This is called, quote, consultations, end quote. It's a way for a complaining party to say, look, we're serious about this issue, and a way for the government of the party accused of a violation to go back to the sectors that benefit from the measure and say, is this really worth the hassle? Something like 1/10 of trade disputes make it to the consultations phase. At that point, a number of things could happen. It's possible that the parties see the light, find a way to resolve their issues, set a path and a timeline to get rid of the problem, and sing Kumbaya. It happens, though rarely. It's also possible that having requested consultations, the complaining party gets cold feet about going further. Lawsuits are disruptive. They cost a lot. They take a long time to finish. The case could be uncertain. That does happen, and it's not rare. It's possible that the party with the violating measure has a Paul on the road to Damascus moment. It sees the light, repents, changes the measure, and sins no more. That does happen, but again, rarely. So it's that about half of the disputes that make it to consultations end up in an actual court case. There are no international trade courts or judges. We call them panels and panelists. Panelists are selected by the disputing parties. They are expected to be independent and will have expertise or experience in law and international trade. After the panel has heard from the parties in writing and orally, it will write a report, that is, a judgment, that sets out the facts, the law, its findings, and how it got there. Where a panel finds that there is a violation, the party found to be in violation must implement or face retaliatory measures. In a sense, this is fairly standard stuff. What sets the CPTPP apart is that it's a regional trade agreement with an already well-functioning dispute settlement process. And it's just like the NAFTA. The first dispute was about Canada's supply management system, specifically how the low tariff limits, TRQs, were allocated. In this case, New Zealand requested consultations with the Government of Canada. The key issues alleged were that Canada's dairy TRQ allocation measures encouraged chronic underfill of its dairy TRQs, reduced their commercial values for exporting CPTPP parties, and undermined the market access that was negotiated under the CPTPP. Under the CPTPP, Canada maintains 16 dairy TRQs. Canada's dairy TRQ allocation measures allocate the entire quota available under each TRQ into up to 3 pools. The quota within each pool is allocated on a market share or equal share basis. These pools can only be accessed by specific importer groups in accordance with rules set out in Canada's dairy TRQ allocation measures. Each importer group is defined under Canada's dairy TRQ allocations measures, and imports that do not fall within a relevant pool are not eligible to apply for or be allocated quota. Essentially, Canada controls and limits the volume of foreign dairy products entering the market. New Zealand argued that Canada's measures appeared to be inconsistent with numerous provisions of the CPTPP. These provisions included Canada's obligation to progressively eliminate its customs duties on originating goods, ensure that the allocation system does not limit allocation to processors, ensure that its procedure for administrating its TRQs are fair and equitable, ensure that it does not allocate any portion of the quota to a producer group, and ensure that if the aggregate TRQ quantity requested by applicants exceeds the quota size, allocation to eligible applications shall be conducted by equitable and transparent methods. Notably, 5 other CPTPP members joined New Zealand in the dispute. This is the great thing about a regional trade agreement with a whole bunch of members. Trading partners can pile on. As consultations failed, a panel was composed. The panel found in favor of New Zealand. New Zealand argued that through this allocation process, Canada was channeling TRQ access away from Canadian importers who could use the preferential tariff rate to import dairy goods from New Zealand and instead gave the quota to domestic processors. The panel found that Canada was in breach of its commitments under the CPTPP, specifically reserving access to some or all of its dairy TRQ allocations only to processors was inconsistent with a number of its obligations. The pooling system was also found to limit the opportunity for otherwise eligible applicants. The parties had 45 days from the panel's report to agree on a reasonable period of time to eliminate any nonconformity. However, later in 2024, New Zealand escalated the dispute, claiming that Canada had not complied with the panel's findings in a reasonable amount of time. As such, the dispute dragged on, with New Zealand threatening further action in 2024, which included the threat of retaliatory tariffs. It then triggered mandatory negotiations under the CPTPP to iron out an agreement, which in October 2024, Canada released a statement noting their disappointment that this issue continues to be challenged. Finally, in July 2025, Canada's Minister of International Trade and Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food announced a resolution. Canada and New Zealand had finally reached a mutually satisfactory solution to resolve the dairy TRQ dispute. The agreement was negotiated in close consultation with Canadian dairy stakeholders and will result in minor policy changes to Canada's TRQ administration. What's next to be disputed remains to be seen. What's next for the CPTPP in general? I would say expansion. The United Kingdom's accession to the CPTPP awaits Canada's ratification process to complete, but it's already entered into force and received ratification from the agreement's other members. 5 other applicants await their turn as well to join the agreement. China, Taiwan, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Uruguay have applied to become parties to the agreement. Though the outcome remains to be seen, we can only assume the future will see more economies looking to gain free access to the growing trade region. Just last week, on November 20th, 2025, the EU and the CPTPP held their inaugural trade and investment dialogue in Melbourne, Australia, making a significant step in strengthening trade relations between the EU and the CPTPP member countries. In my view, at least 3 lessons can be drawn from this development. That the CPTPP is a significant trading arrangement, that U.S. trade policy is forcing trading blocs to cooperate more closely, and that the WTO itself cannot bring about trade liberalization fast enough.
Thank you, Stephen. We're fortunate to have with us Iain Sandford, international trade partner at Foley Hoag in Geneva. Iain started work as a trade lawyer and diplomat at the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade around the same time I joined the Trade Law Bureau in Canada. He lasted in government a lot less than I, though. And after a stint at the appellate body of the Boer Trade Organization, he has been in private practice since 2005. He's joining us from Geneva to talk about the CPTPP. Iain, welcome.
Thanks, Rambod. It's great to be on the show.
It's great to have you. When the UK joined the CPTPP, there was probably 2 different sentiments about it. The first one was, there goes the neighborhood. But probably a more charitable version of it was, okay, well, so this massive trade agreement is expanding. Is UK, given its colonial interests, probably has an island somewhere near the Pacific that it can claim to be a Pacific state of some sort. But then you've got Uruguay, which is definitely facing the Atlantic, and now the EU. So first, I guess the most obvious question is how realistic is this prospect of extra-Pacific expansion? So that's one, and a related one is something that we touched upon in previous episodes. Maybe looking back historically to 1930 and the Ottawa Conference, and the fact that as a result of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, in reaction to American withdrawal from the world, the Commonwealth got together and somehow tried to arrive at some sort of an arrangement. Now, it didn't really last very long. But is that the kind of dynamic that we're seeing? That as a result of the closing of the U.S. market, a new regional framework is being developed around the core of solid trade allies that have demonstrated already their interest in closer relationships.
Yeah, well, thanks, Rambod. That's a couple of really interesting questions. I mean, I think first things first. We shouldn't get too caught up on the word Pacific and the name. It perhaps reflects the origins of the treaty. But I wonder if at some stage they'll get something that the members will find something that's easier to say than either CPTPP or what is it, comprehensive and progressive. agreement for a Trans-Pacific Partnership, which really doesn't roll off the tongue. So maybe there's a name change in the future there. But I think what the agreement represents and why the UK has joined, why Uruguay and others wish to join, is really that in a world of clubs and fences, the CPTPP represents a club of countries, of trading partners that actually have a set of shared values. And in that respect, I think it is a little bit like the old pre-Uruguay round GATT club, which of course started with 26 members who had a similar history, or at least a similar outlook on the post World War II world. And so we're able to agree on a core set of principles and rules, and then over time to actually implement a program of reform, in particular trade liberalization and eventually expansion into other areas of trade, like trade remedies and ultimately services in the Uruguay round. But they were able to build a program based on their shared view of how the world works. Which kind of brings me to your second point, which is comparing the CPTPP to the Ottawa Conference. I'm not sure the analogy is a perfect one, but it's an interesting one. Certainly, I think that one of the key challenges for CPTPP
is obviously the acronym itself. That's one of the primary challenges.
It took me years to practice to actually roll it off, and I just failed to do it. It's not an elegant name for sure. But I think one of the great challenges at the moment for the CPTPP members is the change in US trade policy and this kind of certainly very nationalist trade policy from the US. But it's also a divide and conquer kind of trade policy from the US, where every country is dealt with on a bilateral basis. And so in order to get a deal with the United States, you sometimes have to give preferences or some kind of special treatment to the United States that fits uncomfortably with existing trade relations. And so I think in that kind of world, the CPTPP is certainly a search for a degree of stability and predictability from the trading partners who are members. I think it will really face challenges from the current state of US trade policy, because once things like preferences do creep in, or special treatment for a particular trading partner does creep in, then it's very difficult in a regional integration agreement to actually deal with that. But yeah, there are clearly analogies, and I think that is kind of the number one issue on the trade policy. On the trade policy front at the moment.
It's interesting that you talked about, and Canada should apologize for CPTPP. We added the C and the P. So sorry about that. TPP does roll off the tongue a little easier for sure.
And maybe the new government will move away from it. It's not going to be CMP in very, very much longer, but anyway.
Yeah, fair enough. That may be true. You spoke about this, and what is an emerging problem, of course, is the relationship that the CPTPP members have with the United States and the bilateral agreements vis-a-vis their commitments to their CPTPP partners. But it raises a broader question about the relationships between trading blocs and the CPTPP. In your view, does it even make sense for the EU to be talking to CPTPP, or are the set of rules that govern the EU too different from the principles of CPTPP to actually make it work? And I guess what I'm really driving at is that more political than economic in your view?
I don't know. I mean, at least as I understand the process at the moment, it's not necessarily envisaged that the EU and the CPTPP would link up as a single trading agreement. So in that case, to the extent it is just a dialogue and coordination, I think that's perfectly feasible, because you can accommodate differences in, say, regulatory culture if you have that kind of dialogue. But I think, again, there are probably some shared values, or at least shared economic interests between the EU and the CPTPP countries. Particularly at this time, but certainly around that issue of actually maintaining a degree of stability and predictability in trading relations. So to the extent that these two major trading blocs can find some accommodations that actually allow business to be done on a stable and predictable basis, I think there's a lot of benefit in that, and clearly the respective governments recognise that.
So we talk about expansion in regional agreements and trade agreements almost invariably in terms of adding members. That has been the way expansion has always been seen, I think. But how about substantive expansion? You mentioned trade remedies. Of course, trade remedies, that's still parked in the WTO. You also mentioned services, that's still parked in the WTO largely. Then, of course, there's intellectual property that's parked in the WTO, and probably everyone wants it to stay there or taken out completely. But how realistic is it to expect that in addition to addressing traditional domains of free trade agreements, that members decide they want deeper integration and they want closer collaboration on these other issues in the context of CPTPP? Do you see any drive in that direction?
Yes, certainly. And I think you're right. And in a way, what's happened with the WTO system over the years, or at least with the GATT system over the years, if you think about it, is that things like trade remedies were kind of filled out. There was an initial provision that contemplated that members would have, or contracting parties in those days, would have scope to impose trade remedies. And then over the years, some rules developed around that to discipline the way that they did it, but also to make clear what rights existed. With some other areas like services, like intellectual property, the scope of the agreements was kind of pushed out a little bit into new areas to cover new challenges of international economic engagement, and I think that's perfect. And I think one of the reasons that's been possible in the WTO system and the GATT system was because of those kind of shared values around economic integration. Looking at CPTPP, as I said before, I think the fact that it is a club of fairly like-minded countries means that it is possible to flesh out some of the existing obligations and to push it into new areas. And I know there was a general review of the treaty over the last couple of years, including during Canada's year chairing in 2024, as well as this year under Australia's chair, under the Australian chair. And there does seem to be a willingness to push the agreement into some new areas, so expanding some of the digital trade commitments, more work on facilitation, both around traditional kind of trade facilitation and customs things, but also around competitiveness and business facilitation, which are areas that kind of technically fall within the trade agreement already, but they start to kind of flesh out and deal with some of the real world problems that business encounters. Another one that I think is up for negotiations, perhaps a new provisions on trade and gender, reflecting some of the CPTPP members' existing treaty practice and other FTAs, where they've negotiated some specific commitments in order to kind of level the playing field from a gender perspective. So I think it's quite possible, Rambod.
Although I would just, that's encouraging, and I don't disagree with you, but agriculture, as demonstrated by the first dispute, agriculture continues even within the CPTPP to be incredibly difficult to talk about. And when you think about domestic support, for example, and the domestic support discussions in Geneva, within the CPTPP, there is a broad range of opinion with respect to that. You've got Japan on one side and then New Zealand on the other that is, almost violently opposed, if New Zealanders can be violent, opposed to domestic support. And so It would be fascinating to actually watch the CPTPP operating as a block within the WTO, but agriculture, in my view, and I'm wondering whether you agree or not, but in my view, agriculture continues to be a problem area.
Yeah, I certainly agree that agriculture continues to be a challenging area. In the WTO context, I've done 3 or 4 disputes involving agricultural issues, including on domestic support issues, where the respondent countries in those cases feel, very strongly about the need for domestic support, and they have political constituencies that are both large and vociferous in defending those positions. I would say no. I can see the same dynamic in Canada. I think Canada has a diversity of voices on some of these issues as well. And I remember from the very first meeting with a senior official that I did in Ottawa when I was sent on posting there in 1999. The senior official, who I won't name, so I won't attribute this, but he told me that Canada is one of the world's great free traders with certain blind spots. And with due respect, I think that the blind spots are largely around supply management and a couple of other favoured sectors. Now, within the CPTPP, I see no reason why some of these issues can't be discussed. I think that there is probably a greater degree of coming together on some of the agriculture issues among CPTPP parties than in the WTO. So you have an absence of some of the key protagonists in agriculture negotiations that you see in the WTO. You don't have India there. You don't have the European Union as a CPTPP member. You don't have the United States. And so I think within that framework, you possibly could have some discussions about some of the kind of unfinished business of working towards a fair and market-oriented agricultural trading system, which was promised back in 1986 when GATT contracting parties started negotiating the Uruguay round. And just to signal a kind of maybe a bright spot, agriculture is not just market access. Agriculture is not just domestic support. There's a bunch of other issues there as well. On something like sanitary and phytosanitary issues, I think there's a very positive work program that's existing under both trade agreements like the CPTPP, but also in the WTO, where countries are just trying to actually facilitate trade by smoothing out some of the issues that need to be resolved if you want to have a safe and secure basis for agricultural and food trade. So it's not all disputes. A lot of it is kind of the boring work of actually talking about some pest or disease that happens to be sitting on top of a block of cheese.
Speaking of boring work, let me shift gears a tiny bit, and I'm wondering I'm thinking out loud here. You may know that a while back, Canada and Chile got rid of trade remedy actions between them. What is the prospect of a similar suspension of trade remedies in the context of CPTPP?
A really interesting question. Not one I've really thought about, Rambod. But these kinds of agreements are reached from time to time. So you mentioned Canada, Chile. Australia, New Zealand.
That's right, yeah.
These back in maybe even the late 1980s in trade between the two trading partners. It makes a lot of sense if you really think that competitive markets are important and that competition policy and competition law provides an adequate remedy for pricing practices that are abusive, that abuse market power, or that are predatory. I myself wonder if within a group as big as the CPTPP, you could get a consensus amongst the members to get rid of trade remedies. I think that's particularly true at the moment when global trade is being distorted by sudden shifts in tariff policy, starting in the US, but obviously flowing through to others as they react. That in turn, I think, is going to distort or affect trade flows. And I think trade remedies are going to be part of the toolbox that countries want to use in order to manage the transition to a new equilibrium. So I don't really see it. But, experience among certain trade partners shows that it is possible.
So, as I had indicated earlier, both China and Taiwan are seeking membership to CPTPP. Is that even, let's just talk about China, the PRC. Is that even possible? Does that even make any sense? Would that swamp the CPTPP? And is China actually serious about this, or is it a political play because Taiwan made the request? I realize that you don't know, like, I'm asking you impossible questions here, particularly the last one, the political one, but in your view, what do you think is going on here?
Yeah, look, I really have zero insight in terms of the motivations from either Chinese Taipei or mainland China in terms of their interest in CPTPP. I tend to think that the motivation, I always think that things are done in good faith. And so I tend to think that the motivations are probably around securing a stable and predictable trading environment in the region in which, both of those customs territories actually kind of exist. So on that side, I'm really not too sure what the motivations are, but I think they're pretty bona fide. On the other side, really good question as to whether it happened. I mean, there's these Auckland principles that were agreed by the CPTPP members a few years ago to guide how they'll deal with applications for accession. They include, a commitment to a high quality trade agreement and a history of complying with trade obligations. I think both Chinese Taipei and China could make a case on those grounds. The third one, though, is an ability to command consensus amongst the existing CPTPP countries. And there, I think that's quite a clever bit of diplomatic craftsmanship, putting that principle together, because it means that, the group as a whole can kind of say, we don't think this will get consensus. Without any single member being singled out for blame on that one. And I think that's why it was put in there, probably largely to deal with accessions from large countries like China, perhaps, where there'd be some geopolitical issues as well as the trade issues. That being the case, personally, I think it's unlikely that either of those candidates or potential candidates will join anytime soon. But, the world's a strange place and things are changing very rapidly. So, anything is possible.
I guess one question I had, when we sort of segued into the CPTPP was through the backdoor of dispute settlement. But let's talk about dispute settlement as well. I think there was a time, there was a period before the announcement of the resolution that people were wondering how effective was the dispute settlement mechanism of the CPTPP if it gives rise to a report in relatively short time, but then the implementation takes a lot longer. Given the nature of the undertakings and obligations in the CPTPP, and now that we have an example of a successful dispute resolution, do you expect more activity, more dispute resolution there, especially because then you don't have to worry about appealing into the void or further appeals? The system seems to be functioning. What is your sense about the long-term prospects of CPTPP dispute settlements? Are we going to see in areas covered by the CPTPP even greater activity than we're seeing in the WTO?
Again, really interesting question. I mean, I think that the experience, not only with CPTPP dispute settlement, but with FTA dispute settlement more generally, has been quite positive. Back a few years ago, virtually every trade dispute went to the WTO, and virtually no trade disputes went to bilateral or regional trade agreement dispute settlement. And I think one of the reasons for that was because there was a lack of familiarity, a lack of kind of established practice or expectations around the FTA dispute settlement. I think that's changed. I think now with several CUSMA disputes, the CPTPP example, and disputes under other trade agreements like the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, we're starting to see kind of a degree of, again, predictability about how these cases proceed, not in terms of result, but at least in terms of procedure, in terms of timelines, in terms of, what you get with a report. And I think that builds confidence, and I think that will result in these frameworks being used more and more for disputes. I'm not sure if there are many disputes going on among CPTPP countries at the moment, and that's obviously an essential starting point for any kind of dispute resolution process. But I think members will have confidence to use it, or at least the parties to the agreement will have confidence to use it. One of the things I think that may need to be thought about is whether you need more institutional framework around the dispute settlement system under free trade agreements. And I've been interested to contrast my experience working with the WTO, where you have obviously a standing secretariat, all of the support that gives you, including meeting rooms and an established set of procedures. It's interesting to contrast with some of the free trade agreement dispute settlement experience, where the tribunal members are effectively doing a lot of that heavy lifting, including administrative heavy lifting themselves, to try and work through the disputes. Interestingly, in some contexts, like the recent TCA dispute about sand deals between the EU and the UK, there the tribunal actually used the services of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague to provide some secretariat administrative services as well as assistance to the arbitrators. And I wonder if that sort of thing is a potential model for FTA dispute settlement more generally. Either that or some kind of more permanent secretariat whose job it is to assist dispute tribunals to do their work.
Or why not a secretariat for hire, an enterprising private sector initiative?
Interesting. Why not? I mean, that's an interesting idea, Rambod.
Are you suggesting a particular law firm, for example?
We definitely have the infrastructure for it.
Look, there's a logic to all of that, and I think it probably would also mean, I'm not being critical of the decision that was made, but it might actually result in a better decision, in that tribunal members will be doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is actually looking at the merits of the case and not worrying about some of the other administrative matters. I suspect that there will be members who don't want to spend the money. I think the money will be it's tiny. But there still will be some hesitancy to create these institutions because of the costs associated with them. I would also say, just as an observation, I mean, we talked about the consultations and the consultation process. Consultations are enormously useful. And certainly in my experience at the WTO, when I was there, there's two great cases where consultations were launched, one by Canada, one against Canada, where the issues were resolved. The formal consultations are a really effective way to demonstrate that the member is serious about moving forward. I don't really know to what extent cost is an issue when it comes to dispute settlement, because again, I'm not sure how expensive these disputes are vis-a-vis like the level of trade for for example. I think my other observation on dispute settlement, though, is that when it comes to something like the New Zealand-Canada dairy dispute, the fact that there's a very organized and wealthy stakeholder group in Canada makes it more difficult for these issues to be resolved at the consultation stage. I mean, I don't think New Zealand really had a choice, but to push ahead, because I just don't get the sense that Canada would be willing to say to dairy farmers, for example, okay, that's fine. They have a point. They have this political necessity, which is one of the downsides, I think, to the dispute settlement process, unfortunately.
I mean, I think that, there's a range of dispute settlement tools that are available. And what they're all trying to do, Stephen, is get to that point where a domestic industry, can or has no choice but to accept a resolution of the dispute on, some kind of agreeable terms. The whole thing is really, I think, a process of adjustment of expectations,
Right.
just like any negotiation. And what you can sometimes get in consultations is that adjustment at an early stage. Mediation facilitated processes are sometimes also very useful. Or sometimes it's very useful to have a tribunal say, you're right, you're wrong. This is the legal kind of split. So go away and do something with that. Cost is always an issue, or at least resources is always an issue. But there is a balance, I think, between the resources you invest in a dispute settlement framework and the quality of what you get out of it. So, one of the things that I can see from the reports is that, it's clearly FTA arbitrators have taken to heart the direction to do their work quickly and to meet things like 90-day deadlines. But if you're doing that and also resolving, complex factual and legal issues, and booking a hearing room and organising the papers, at some point there's that you're demanding a little bit much, and something will give, and the something might be, the thoughtfulness of the decision, and therefore the kind of legitimacy of the decision. So, countries who think that these processes are worthwhile will need ultimately, I think, to resource the system sufficiently to get the quality that they want out of it.
Iain, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure and a great privilege, I think, speaking for myself and BLG, to have you on.
Absolutely. This was fascinating, and it's great to have somebody who actually is coming at this a little bit differently than Canada, for example, just by virtue of your nationality on the dairy dispute. But it's good to talk to somebody from a committed free trade country and who understands CPTPP so well. So thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. It's been a lot of fun, and I've got a lot of time for Canada, having spent a few years there, and with my daughter having been born there. So great to be on the Canadian podcast.
Great.
Phenomenal. Thank you. This brings us to the end of our session today. And again, we thank Iain for being with us. Finally, a project of this kind requires a lot of work to bring together. In particular, honorable mention is reserved for Alex Zutis, articling student, and our producer, Jason Chute, and of course, the entire technical staff of BLG. Goodbye.